A Viennese sentry stands on the Rubble bastion, one of Vienna's strongest fortifications, at 2 a.m. on a warm July night in 1683. He's been hearing strange sounds for days. Not the boom of cannons, something worse, a rhythmic tapping from beneath his feet. Before he can report it to his commander, the ground opens up. The entire bastion erupts in a column of fire and debris that shoots 300 feet into the air. The explosion is so massive that people in the city center, a mile away, are thrown from their beds. When the dust settles, a 40-foot crater sits where the bastion used to be. 12 tons of gunpowder, packed into a tunnel carved directly beneath the walls, has just vaporized one of Vienna's key defenses. But it doesn't end there. This is just the first mine. The Ottomans have 30 more tunnels snaking beneath Vienna's walls. This isn't a scene from a disaster movie. This was the reality of Vienna in the summer of 1683. The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its engineering prowess, brought a weapon to the gates of Europe that Christian forces had never seen at this scale. Not just cannons, not just overwhelming numbers, a systematic, industrial approach to siege warfare that combined massive artillery, underground mining operations, and psychological warfare into a machine designed to break both walls and wills. This is the story of the Siege of Vienna, the battle that saved Europe not through heroic cavalry charges, but through a desperate game of cat and mouse played in tunnels beneath the earth, where Christian miners raced against Ottoman sappers in a war fought in darkness with pickaxes, and it came within a hair's breadth of succeeding. Before diving into this forgotten technical war beneath Vienna's streets, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of military history that challenge the clean narratives, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these engineering battles together from different parts of the world, connected by our shared fascination with how wars are really won. To understand why the Ottoman superweapon nearly succeeded where others had failed, we need to correct a massive misconception about the Siege of Vienna. In popular culture, especially after certain recent films, the siege is portrayed as a straightforward clash. Noble Christians defending, barbaric Ottomans attacking. Polish cavalry saves the day at the last minute. Roll credits. To understand why the Ottoman superweapon nearly succeeded where others had failed, we need to correct a massive misconception about the Siege of Vienna. In popular culture, especially after certain recent films, the siege is portrayed as a straightforward clash. Noble Christians defending, barbaric Ottomans attacking. Polish cavalry saves the day at the last minute. Roll credits. That is propaganda, pure and simple. The Ottoman army that arrived at Vienna's gates in July 1683 wasn't a medieval horde. This was the most advanced siege force in the world, commanded by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a man who had spent his entire career perfecting the art of taking fortified cities. The numbers alone should tell you something. He brought 170 cannons, not small field pieces. We're talking about massive bronze siege guns, some weighing over 10 tons, that could fire stone balls the size of basketballs through 15 feet of masonry. These weren't just weapons. They were engineering marvels, cast in Ottoman foundries, using techniques refined over centuries. The largest of these guns, called Shahi, required teams of 100 oxen to transport and crews of 200 men to operate. When they fired, the concussion could knock men off their feet 50 yards away. The Ottomans had learned through bitter experience how to position these monsters for maximum effect, how to aim them using geometry and mathematics that European gunners were only beginning to understand. But the cannons were just the opening act. The real superweapon was beneath the ground. The Ottoman Corps of Engineers, the Leyhamki, were the elite of the elite. These men weren't conscripts or common soldiers given shovels. They were professional miners, recruited from regions with mining traditions in Anatolia and the Balkans, trained from childhood in the dark art of sapping. They knew geology. They could identify soil types by feel, predict water tables, shore up tunnels through clay and limestone, and most importantly, they knew exactly how much gunpowder to pack beneath a fortification to bring it down, without collapsing their own tunnels. Here's a detail that shows the sophistication of their operation. The Leyhamki used listening devices, basically large earthenware jars filled with water, placed in their tunnels to detect enemy counter-mining operations. The water would ripple when enemy miners were working nearby, giving the Ottomans advance warning of Christian countermines. This wasn't medieval warfare, this was applied physics. Kara Mustafa looked at Vienna's walls and saw them not as obstacles, but as a geometric problem to be solved. The city was surrounded by a star fort design, bastions jutting out at angles to provide overlapping fields of fire, strong against direct assault, expensive to build, a masterpiece of Italian military architecture that had made medieval siege tactics obsolete. But every bastion sat on ground, and ground could be tunneled through. So he gave the order that would define the siege: dig. Within days of arriving, Ottoman engineers began sinking shafts outside Vienna's walls, not random tunnels. A coordinated network of approach trenches and mine shafts, surveyed with precision, using tools that looked primitive but worked perfectly. They used weighted plumb lines to keep tunnels level. They calculated angles and distances. They mapped out the entire underground approach before a single grain of gunpowder was placed. The engineers worked in 3 8-hour shifts, around the clock. The excavated dirt was hauled away in baskets, processed, and used to build earthwork fortifications that crept closer to the walls each day. It was industrial warfare. A factory of destruction, operating with the efficiency of a well-run business. They even had a quality control system. Senior engineers inspected every tunnel, checking the shoring, measuring the angles, ensuring that when the time came to fill these passages with explosives, the blast would go up into the fortifications above, not sideways into adjacent tunnels. Inside Vienna, Count Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the commander of the garrison, stood on the walls and watched the Ottoman trenches. He was 47 years old, a veteran of multiple campaigns, and he knew exactly what he was looking at. He had 11,000 soldiers and 5,000 armed civilians against an Ottoman force estimated at 150,000. The math was simple and terrifying. He couldn't win a direct fight. His only hope was to hold long enough for relief to arrive. The Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I had fled Vienna weeks earlier, promising to return with an army. Starhemberg's job was to keep Vienna standing until that happened, but then the tapping started. This is where the siege of Vienna turns into a horror story. The defenders could hear the Ottomans digging beneath them. At night, soldiers would press their ears to the ground and listen to the rhythmic sound of pickaxes striking stone, getting closer. Day by day, they knew what was coming. The Ottomans would pack the tunnel with barrels of gunpowder, light a slow-burning fuse, and collapse the tunnel entrance. The defenders above would have maybe 30 seconds of warning before the world exploded beneath their feet. Imagine being a soldier on wall duty. You're standing guard on a bastion, and beneath your feet, you can hear men digging, working their way closer. You know they're packing that tunnel with enough gunpowder to send you and everyone near you into the sky in pieces, and there's nothing you can do but wait and hope that someone else, underground, in the dark, can stop them before they light the fuse. Starhemberg's solution was to fight fire with fire. He ordered his own mining corps, led by a German engineer named George Rimpler, to start digging countermines. Rimpler was a military engineer who'd studied Ottoman siege techniques and understood the game they were playing. The goal was to intercept Ottoman tunnels before they reached the walls. If the Christian miners could break into an Ottoman tunnel, they could either collapse it or fight the sappers in brutal underground combat. Rimpler organized his miners into teams of 20 men. Each team had diggers, timber specialists to shore up tunnels, and combat specialists armed with short swords and grenades for when they broke through into enemy tunnels. They worked in complete darkness except for small oil lamps that gave off more smoke than light. The air in these tunnels was thick, humid, and often poisonous from bad air pockets in the soil. What followed was one of the strangest aspects of warfare in history. Beneath Vienna, in darkness broken only by flickering oil lamps, men fought with shovels, axes, and grenades in tunnels so narrow they had to crawl. The Christian counterminers would dig toward the sound of Ottoman pickaxes, using those same listening devices the Ottomans used, stolen from captured Turkish positions. Sometimes they'd break through and find themselves face to face with enemy sappers. The fighting in these encounters was vicious and claustrophobic. No formations, no tactics, just desperate men stabbing and clubbing each other in spaces so tight you couldn't swing a sword properly. Men fought with daggers, with mining picks, with their bare hands. The wounded couldn't be evacuated easily. They'd lie in the tunnels, blocking passage, sometimes drowning in the water that seeped through the soil. One Christian miner, a man named Johann from Saxony, kept a journal that survived the siege. He described breaking into an Ottoman tunnel near the Berg Bastion on August 3rd. He wrote that the air was so thick with dust and gunpowder residue that men were coughing blood within minutes. His team fought the Ottoman sappers with axes and short swords in a tunnel segment maybe 50 feet long and 4 feet wide. They killed 3 Ottomans before the enemy sappers retreated and collapsed the tunnel behind them. Johann's team barely escaped before their own tunnel caved in from the vibrations. 2 of his men were buried alive. They didn't have time to dig them out before Ottoman miners broke through from a different angle, and they had to retreat. This happened dozens of times. The underground war became its own separate siege, with its own casualties, its own heroes, its own tactical calculations. Rimpler kept detailed maps of all known Ottoman tunnel positions, updating them daily based on intelligence from listening posts, and captured enemy miners. He was fighting a 3-dimensional chess game in the dark. But for every Ottoman tunnel the Christians intercepted, 2 more went undetected. The Ottomans had more men, more engineers, and more experience. They'd been perfecting these techniques for a century. They were winning the underground war. On July 14th, the first major mine exploded. The Lobel Bastion, as mentioned earlier, simply ceased to exist. The blast created a breach in Vienna's defenses, 60 feet wide, and sent stone blocks the size of carriages flying through the air. One block landed in the courtyard of the Imperial Palace, nearly a quarter-mile away. Ottoman Janissaries immediately charged the gap, climbing over the still-smoking rubble under covering fire from hundreds of muskets positioned in the forward trenches. Starhemberg threw everything he had at the breach. Hand-to-hand fighting lasted for 6 hours. The defenders managed to hold, but barely. They built a makeshift inner wall, using rubble, furniture dragged from nearby houses, and the bodies of the dead stacked like sandbags. This became standard procedure. Every time a mine exploded, the race was to plug the gap before the Ottomans could pour through in numbers too great to stop. Over the next month, the Ottomans detonated 15 more mines. Each explosion was a calculated strike designed to open breaches that could be assaulted. Some were small, designed to collapse specific sections of wall. Others were massive, meant to create chaos and terror. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers never knew when the next explosion would come. Men refused to sleep near the walls. Officers had to threaten executions to keep troops at their posts, and each time, the defenders had to plug the gap with whatever they could find, whoever they could spare. The garrison was bleeding out. Casualties weren't just from the explosions and the assaults. Disease was rampant. Dysentery killed more men than Ottoman bullets. Food was running low. The city's population was slowly starving. Here's a detail that shows how desperate Vienna became. By early August, the defenders were eating rats, leather belts boiled until soft, and anything that could be chewed. Starhemberg imposed strict rationing, executing anyone caught hoarding food, but people were dying of starvation inside the walls, even as the Ottomans outside ate well from their supply trains, stretching back hundreds of miles to Ottoman territory. The psychological warfare was deliberate. Ottoman soldiers would roast meat within sight and smell of the walls, letting the aroma of cooking lamb drift into the city. It was cruel. It was calculated. It was effective. The artillery bombardment never stopped. Ottoman cannons fired day and night, pulverizing Vienna's buildings into rubble. The gunners worked in shifts, maintaining a constant rain of stone and iron on the city. The city's famous St. Stephen's Cathedral was hit repeatedly. Its roof collapsed inward. Fires raged through residential districts as red-hot cannonballs landed on wooden houses. By mid-August, Vienna looked like it had been hit by an earthquake. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to smoking ruins. The population huddled in cellars, living underground, just like the miners, praying that the next explosion wouldn't be directly above them. But Starhemberg held. He was everywhere at once, inspecting defenses, encouraging exhausted soldiers, personally leading counterattacks when Ottoman forces gained footholds in the breaches. He rotated his soldiers between the walls and the counter-mining operations, ensuring no one unit bore too much of the burden. He executed deserters publicly to maintain discipline. but he also shared the same rations as his men, sleeping in the same conditions, refusing privileges. The soldiers respected him for it. He sent messengers through Ottoman lines, brave men who volunteered to sneak past enemy patrols, begging for word of the relief army. Where were they? Were they coming? The messengers who made it back brought promises but no concrete timelines. The emperor was gathering forces from across the Holy Roman Empire, from Poland, from Bavaria, but armies moved slowly. Vienna would have to hold. The Ottomans grew impatient. Kara Mustafa was under pressure from Sultan Mehmed IV to finish the siege. The Sultan wanted Vienna as a prize. It would open the road to Germany, to the heart of Christian Europe, but the calendar was Kara Mustafa's enemy. It was mid-August. Winter would come by November, maybe earlier. His army, despite its size and sophistication, was starting to suffer from disease and supply problems. The longer the siege dragged on, the more vulnerable his force became to a relief army catching him between the walls and reinforcements. He needed a knockout blow, so he ordered the construction of the largest mine yet, a massive tunnel, wider and deeper than all the others, aimed directly at Vienna's weakest point, the Bergravillon, a forward defensive position that protected one of the main gates. The tunnel was a masterpiece of engineering. It ran 300 feet from the Ottoman lines, passed beneath several defensive ditches, and terminated directly beneath the Bergravillon's powder magazine. If this mine succeeded, it would blow a hole so large the Ottomans could pour their entire army through before the defenders could respond. Christian counterminers detected the tunnel in late August. They tried desperately to intercept it, digging 3 separate countermines based on triangulated listening post data. They failed. The Ottoman tunnel was too deep, too well shored, and protected by a web of false tunnels designed to draw off countermining efforts. Rimpler knew it was there. He could calculate roughly where it would emerge, but he couldn't stop it. So instead, he prepared for it. This is where George Rimpler earns his place in history. He couldn't stop the mine, but he could plan for the explosion. He ordered the construction of a secondary inner wall behind the Bergravillon. Hidden from Ottoman observation by the rubble and earthworks, it wasn't much. Just a hastily built barrier of earth and timber. But it was something. When the Bergravillon exploded, the Ottomans would expect to charge into a gap. Instead, they'd hit a second line of defense. On September 8th, the Ottomans packed 20 tons of gunpowder into the chamber beneath the Bergravillon. 20 tons. For context, the mine that destroyed the Rubble bastion used 12 tons and obliterated a 40-foot section of wall. This mine was designed to crack Vienna open like an egg. The fuse was lit at dawn. The defenders saw smoke rising from the Ottoman tunnel entrance and knew what was coming. Soldiers on the walls started running. Officers screamed orders. Everyone within 300 yards of the Bergravillon sprinted for cover. Some men threw themselves into defensive ditches, others ran into buildings, pressing themselves against walls. The explosion was cataclysmic. It registered on primitive seismograph in Prague, 250 miles away. The entire Bergravillon, along with sections of the adjacent walls, was hurled into the air. Witnesses said the column of earth and debris reached higher than the cathedral spire. The blast wave shattered windows across Vienna. The sound was heard as far as Bratislava. The crater left behind was 80 feet wide and 30 feet deep. Groundwater immediately began seeping in, creating a mud pit. But here's where engineering saved Vienna. Rimpler's secondary wall held. When the dust settled from the massive explosion, the Ottomans charged the breach expecting to pour into an undefended gap. 10,000 Janissaries, the elite of the Ottoman army, surged forward with ladders and siege equipment, screaming their battle cries. They ran straight into a second wall, manned by soldiers who'd had just enough time to get into position. The surprise was total. The Ottomans had thrown everything into this assault. They'd committed their best troops, thinking this was the breakthrough. Instead, they found themselves funneled into a killing zone. The fighting at the Bergravillon breach lasted 2 days. It was the bloodiest combat of the entire siege. The Ottomans threw wave after wave of Janissaries at the inner wall. The defenders fought with everything. Muskets fired point blank into packed formations. Grenades rolled down into the crater. Boiling oil, heated in massive cauldrons behind the lines, was poured on men trying to scale the walls. Rocks, pieces of masonry, furniture. At one point, The fighting was so close that soldiers were grabbing enemy soldiers and physically throwing them off the walls. The defenders took horrific casualties. By the end of the second day, the inner wall was held by wounded men, old civilians, and anyone who could hold a weapon. Starhemberg personally led a counterattack that pushed the Ottomans back from a foothold they'd gained on the left side of the breach. He killed 3 Janissaries himself with a halberd before being pulled back by his officers. Kara Mustafa watched from his command tent and realized he'd made a critical error. He'd put all his faith in the superweapon. The mines, the cannons, the engineering. He'd assumed that superior technology would crack Vienna open like it had cracked open dozens of other fortresses across Hungary and the Balkans, but he'd underestimated the sheer bloody-minded determination of men fighting for their homes and families. The defenders weren't going to break, they'd die first, and they were dying. But they weren't breaking, and then, on September 11th, 1683, the relief army arrived. Scouts reported a massive force descending from the Vienna woods. The Holy Roman Emperor hadn't returned, but he'd sent something better. A coalition army led by Polish King Jan III Sobieski, with German and Austrian contingents totaling 70,000 men. They'd marched for weeks to get here. The Battle of Vienna that followed, with the famous charge of the Polish Hussars, gets all the glory. But here's the truth that military historians know. The siege was already won by the time the relief army showed up. The Ottomans had shot their load. They were exhausted, demoralized, and low on supplies. Kara Mustafa's superweapon had failed, not because the engineering was bad. The Ottoman mines and cannons were masterpieces of military technology. They failed because you can't engineer away human stubbornness. When Sobieski led 20,000 cavalry down the slopes of Kallenberg into the Ottoman camp, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The Ottoman army, which had spent 2 months battering itself against Vienna's walls, broke almost immediately. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The camp, with all its artillery, supplies, and treasure, was abandoned. The famous Ottoman tents, the siege guns, mountains of gunpowder, food stores, everything was left behind. Kara Mustafa escaped with his life, but not for long. Sultan Mehmed IV, furious at the failure and the loss of prestige, had him executed in Belgrade on December 25, 1683. He was strangled with a silk cord, the traditional method for high-ranking Ottomans who displeased the Sultan. His head was sent to Constantinople as proof of execution, displayed on a pike as a warning to other commanders. The man who'd brought the most sophisticated siege force in the world to the gates of Vienna died disgraced, a scapegoat for a strategic failure that had more to do with logistics and luck than his engineering prowess. This is where the story takes its dark turn. The victory at Vienna didn't lead to peace. It led to centuries of brutal warfare between Christian and Muslim forces in the Balkans. The myth of Vienna as a holy victory, Christian civilization triumphing over the Islamic threat, became propaganda that justified some of the worst atrocities of the early modern period. The siege, that was won through engineering and stubbornness, was rewritten as a religious crusade. The technical reality was buried under layers of triumphalist mythology. And what about the superweapon, the Ottoman mining and artillery techniques that nearly broke Vienna? They were studied, copied, and improved by European armies. The very methods that almost conquered Vienna became the foundation for European siege warfare in the 18th century. French military engineers, particularly Vauban, studied Ottoman siege methods and incorporated them into their own doctrines. The students learned from the master, then turned those lessons back on the Ottoman Empire. By the 1700s, it was Christian armies using advanced siege mining to crack open Ottoman fortresses across Eastern Europe. The technology that defined the siege of Vienna became a weapon against the people who'd perfected it. The Ottomans found themselves on the receiving end of their own innovations as European engineers applied Ottoman techniques with European industrial capacity. This is why we don't make movies about the real siege of Vienna. It's messy. The heroes are exhausted. Starving men fighting in tunnels filled with bad air and the constant threat of collapse. The villains are brilliant engineers doing their jobs with skill and precision. The victory leads to centuries of ethnic and religious violence that continues to echo in Balkan politics today. There's no clean moment of triumph, just mud, blood and the realization that wars are won by whoever can dig deeper and hold on longer. The Polish cavalry charge looks better on screen. It's visual, dramatic, easy to film, but it was the miners working in darkness beneath Vienna's walls who actually saved Europe. They just don't get statues or epic poems. They get footnotes in engineering textbooks and the occasional mention in military histories focused on siege warfare. George Rimpler survived the siege and went on to design fortifications across the Holy Roman Empire, incorporating everything he'd learned, fighting the Ottomans underground. He died in 1683, not from wounds, but from disease contracted during the siege. His body gave out 3 months after the relief. Count Starhemberg received honors, titles, and a place in Austrian history. But he never commanded troops in combat again. He'd used up everything he had holding Vienna. He spent his remaining years as a military administrator, living quietly until his death in 1701. The Ottoman Liamsi, the master engineers who'd built the tunnels and calculated the mine placements, scattered after the siege. Some returned to Anatolia. Others found work with other armies. A few ended up training European engineers in Ottoman methods. The knowledge didn't die with the defeat. It spread, evolved, and changed the face of warfare. So the next time you hear about the Siege of Vienna, remember it wasn't won by heroic charges or divine intervention. It was won by men with shovels, racing against time, and enemy sappers in tunnels that could collapse or explode at any moment. Remember the Ottoman engineers who built weapons of such precision and power that they nearly changed the course of European history. And remember that the superweapon isn't always the biggest cannon or the fastest cavalry. Sometimes it's just the willingness to dig deeper than your enemy, to shore up one more tunnel, to hold one more day when every instinct screams that you should run. That's what saved Vienna, not glory. Just stubbornness, engineering, and men refusing to quit, even when the ground was literally exploding beneath their feet.